Go ahead.
Hello, world.
Go
Um,
ahead.
Today I'm particularly honored to have a conversation with Dr. who, in my opinion, is one of the greatest anarchist thinkers. Um, I also happen to be renewing my marriage contract on the blockchain today with my husband, of course. Hi. And Florian, who started it. Hello. Yeah, and I'm also really delighted to have Kent in this conversation, who will talk more about our reputation system and how contracts are actually enforced on the blockchain. And I'm really grateful to Joffrey for organizing everything, and also um, Jacob and Alma for assisting in everything. So, Larkin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, if anybody doesn't know me, I'm kind of a general anti-statist, enemy of the state, troublemaker, author of The Most Dangerous Superstition. I have a whole bunch of videos and articles about voluntarism and non-aggression principle and self-ownership and how government is inherently immoral and incompatible with what society ought to be. Maybe I should say government as we know it, and I'll try not to nitpick about semantics because even the word nation to so many people implies government, but I can't think of a better word that you could have used. So Bitnation, I won't complain about. But I did want to sort of throw in a disclaimer that um, when I hear of an idea and I look into it and I think it sounds cool and good, and I do this with my own ideas too, the first thing I do, it's sort of part of the scientific method, is try to find weak points and try to find areas where it might not work. Um, and so I want to start off by saying I don't want anything in anything I say or ask about in this interview to sound like I'm bashing the idea. I think the idea of Bitnation sounds really cool, which is why I want to delve into how might it do this and how might it do that. And I don't, just like in public, I tend to debate things that I disagree about with people instead of sitting around, you know, having having both sides just say, yeah, we agree, yeah, we agree. But I did read the whole white paper earlier today. I won't pretend I understood the whole white paper because I'm relatively ignorant about a lot of the related technology, but I definitely get the general point. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to start by throwing that in because and like I said, I do that with my own ideas too. I immediately look for anything wrong with it and try to make it not work. It's what you do to any like scientific discovery or theory is I'm going to see if it'll withhold like the closest scrutiny and trying to find things wrong with it. So I don't want people getting the impression that I don't like the idea. I do like the idea, which is the only reason I agreed to do this interview and stuff.
Exactly. I mean, so this is why we wanted to talk, right? So when we had our meetup in Acapulco, the Bitnation meetup in Acapulco, you raised some really interesting questions about the reputation system. And because I'm going to get to that in a moment, but first let me, for those who were not there, let me just give the broader context. So we hosted a meetup and Larkin had a lot of good points about our reputation system and how it works and our stance on positive versus negative enforcement of the reputation. And these are some very hard questions that we have to deal with. Going from Web 2.0 to Web 3.0, this is going to be one of the most important questions because if you don't have a nation state, so the way the nation state would deal with a problem is through putting a person in a cage. They would throw a person in jail. Obviously, in a post-nation state reality, you know, that's not an option really, you know. So then reputation becomes the most important, let's say, enforcement factor, right? And you know, so Kent, I see you scratching your head, and so Kent is the designer, chief architect of Lucy, our AI bot that defines the reputation system. So maybe you want to say a bit about how it works.
Yeah, sure. I guess it's hard for me to figure out how to jump right into this, but I would observe that I have worked almost the entirety of my career in private enterprise, and certified for Lean Six Sigma. And one of the things I learned within the context of that is that you can't improve something you can't measure, right? So, and I've been responsible for managing product lines on behalf of the company, which means that I've been responsible for a P&L, profit and loss. And that means that ultimately I have to make decisions about what constitutes the best return on investment relative to the broader portfolio. And the point being is that if I can't evaluate the fitness or performance of a particular operation, I can't make a decision about what constitutes the best trade-off. And concurrently, I've spent a great deal of time engaged in grassroots political advocacy on behalf of underserved populations, specifically marginalized populations. And a real interest in the last several years have been people that are homeless and houseless and mentally ill and on the streets. They are, in effect, marginalized from our society. And from their perspective, they exist within a failed state. And it's like a state that hasn't actually declared defeat yet, but they happen to live at the margins of it. So the real trick is that how can you provide them a solution which enables them to make good decisions about what constitutes trade-offs. And as it turns out, this particular model is applicable across the different spectrum. So in the very simplest terms, let's say that I engage in an agreement with Florian to do some work. And at the end of it, we evaluate one another as it pertains to what we call fitness. Well, our definition of fitness actually has 9 different attributes to it, including but not limited to efficiency, timeliness, transparency, how easy is it to understand, efficacy, that's interesting, I can talk about that in a moment. And over time, so it ends up being something similar to what we would associate with a Yelp score, except that you can't give each other a score unless you've actually involved in a transaction. And further, you can't game the system by creating a bunch of fake profiles. In fact, my background is security and information security and anti-fraud, and I know a substantial amount about the use of what is called symbols or fake accounts to game the system. So we have a fellow on staff, Johan, which is a delight. The guy keeps coming up with designs to completely confound the use of symbols. And it's been a blast to share that with my people because they're vexed in the extreme about how he's going to completely ruin them. So it's pretty cool. In any event, what's pretty neat about this is that in short order, you end up with a collection of prior decisions, which land in what we call the exocortex, which is essentially a shared memory repository. And this is the really fun thing about what we associate with artificial intelligence, is that AI by itself typically is kind of idiotic. It's like I like to say, my great aunt Thelma had Alzheimer's. She still had a keen mind, but she had no memory, so she was deranged, right? So this is the state of AIs. If they have no functional memory, they don't do anything. So the design around Lucy and the exocortex is one that increasingly leverages the collective wisdom of prior decisions. And so we get to populate use cases like, let's say that I'm a transgendered person who lives in Yemen who would like to have my rights to property honored and respected within a governance model. And, frankly, that existing governance model is not functional. So what they need to be able to do is to seize agency on their terms and to do so with the trust and confidence that would be honored. well, leveraging the exocortex and the prior decisions aligned to what we call fitness, this can be done fairly easily. With the architecture that we have designed and are creating, this would be automatically populated to the end nodes, the person who is on the mobile device, a low performing device on a less than reliable network, and would be able to immediately see which nation governance entities happen to satisfy their needs in order of effectiveness and fitness. And I did want to talk a little bit about efficacy. I had worked a couple of jobs ago working on a system that would provide efficacy for intellectual property around at the enterprise level. And efficacy is fascinating. Frequently, you can't actually deliver that. But once you've added the attribute of efficacy, you can make trade-off decisions. So it's exciting to think about how we are implementing it in this context. It deeply empowers the people at the end nodes to make good decisions. So.
Thank you, Kendall. And now let me do like a few second description for everyone who's not taking from class. So basically, what we're talking about is the reputation system on Pangea. And so there are 3 non-tradable tokens. I will address one of them in this conversation. Proof of agreement. Proof of agreement is non-tradable token that is awarded to everyone when they enter into a contract, when they execute a contract, or when they resolve a dispute attached to a contract. It is non-tradable because we don't want reputation to be able to be bought or sold or gained through reputation, gained through attention or popularity or whatever, right? It should be, reputation should be strictly meritocratic. And this is also why you see the bottom is distributing the non-tradable reputation tokens, because UC does not have human emotions, and therefore is not subject to like human, biases. Anyways, yeah, Larkin, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, that brings up to sort of get back to the original question I asked, and again, I'm sure I'm not the first person to think of this and mention it, and I'm sure you've thought of it before, but trying to do the balancing act between anonymity and reputation, where on the one hand you want people to be able to, for other reasons, to be able to have people not know who they are, while at the same time not being able to just make up a series of fake thems, basically. Like, okay, I'm going to make 3 different me's in Bitnation and build up a reputation on each, and then 2 of them can be viewed as disposable. And if I decide to do some slimy thing and like get a good reputation and then rip people off and run away with that one, I still have the other 2. In the real world, obviously, you can't do that because you're just you and you look like you. I can't just like shave my mustache. No, I'm not the guy who just beat you up and stole your stuff yesterday. Now I'm somebody completely different. It doesn't, there are natural limitations to it, and you'd have to, again, I'm sure you've thought about this, but make up artificial limitations so that you can have a person and you have no idea who they are, and yet there is just as much for them to risk getting a bad reputation or not getting a good reputation, however you want to describe it.
So what you're talking about is called a Sybil attack. A Sybil attack is when a person creates multiple identities, like thousands of identities, right? It's from a popular book and movie, actually, the term. But so the way Sybil attacks works in Bitnation is that whenever you do a contract, there are mining fees. Right now we have the Ether chain integrated. We will, since we're blockchain agnostic, we'll have other chains in the future. But right now, the Ether chain is integrated, and every time you do a contract on Ethereum, you have to pay a little bit of mining fees. So we have adjusted the path reward so that the path reward is always lower than the mining. right? So that basically the opportunity cost goes down significantly. So you could technically conduct a civil attack, but you would actually lose a lot more money than you would win. So there is no financial upside to it.
There's a lot of different vectors on this. It's actually a really valid point. My prior employer provided anti-fraud and real-time authentication services to a vast number of companies, to the scope of actively monitoring 3.8 billion devices, half of them mobile, and billions of transactions. And the fraud behavior that people engage in is almost of infinite variety, but the civil attack is extremely common. So there are lots of different categories. One of them, for instance, is what they call breakout fraud, where they will pick up a defunct account, build up reputation, and then make a large transaction and run off with it, right? So the point being is that, you know, we could take this offline and have a lot of really actually pretty good discussions. And I enjoy the conversations, because it is a healthy, it's exactly how we are structured within Bitnation, is a challenge, and it builds a strong muscle memory. And it's because we have a couple of different dimensions on this, is that, you know, how do we build a system that enables somebody who is living within the margins of a failed state to establish and build relationships of trust with people that they don't know, and they still want to maintain their anonymity, while protecting the system from the almost inevitable temptation to game it, right? So, you know, these are very much the trade-offs that we've had to determine. And ultimately, as Susanna pointed out, we believe that not only does the design create a financial disincentive for gaming it in that manner, but it also significantly hurts the person who's trying to engage in fraud, because it creates such a vast delta between those who have created and accrued reputation relative to those who haven't. It just turns into a cost-benefit situation.
I
but
mean,
there's a lot.
The way, sorry, Kenton, let me just, Larkin, the way you can think of it is, if you go to hotels.com, for instance, you know, you can see someone who got 5 stars on hotels.com, but if there is only one reviewer and one comment, you can quickly jump to the conclusion that that is probably not very accurate, right? Mm-hmm. So it's basically like stacking up reputation over time.
So to build up reputation requires a lot of time and a lot of effort, as it does in real life. Mm. Mm-hmm. And so to build up multiple profiles also will mean that you will have to invest a lot in building those 3. In fact, you will have to have 3 lives in order to do that. So we're trying to make it so that it is arduous, and you really have to become an honorable person to build up reputation over time. So undoubtedly, and secondly, there's an element of network effect. The more people who come and live their lives on Pangaea, the more incentive there is to sustain your reputation on the platform, and not to need and to go, because if you break your word then you have nowhere else to go. You're stuck on the more people who use the platform, the more likely it's more likely that people will have a stronger incentive to be more honourable there. So to some degree, it depends on how many people we get on the platform.
Thank you. So to address the point that you initially made about being anonymous versus pseudonymous, so what is the difference? So the difference is, if you're anonymous, it means you have no reputation or whatever, right? Pseudo-anonymity means that you can't attach your online identity to your flesh body, right? Through biometrics or whatever. Mm-hmm. But it means you are not anonymous in the sense that people know who recognize your chosen name. Like my chosen name is XSTT, for instance. And people recognize that chosen name. and I have a track record, right? So that's the difference between anonymity and pseudo-anonymity. So in Bitnation, we embrace pseudo-anonymity, right? In the sense that we believe that the reputation system is, in fact, the most important enforcement mechanism. But we also believe that people shouldn't be personally proactive, and that probably anyone who's trying to enforce blockchain biometrics will most probably cause the next Holocaust.
So putting identity on the, if you put people's biometrics on an immutable ledger on the blockchain, I mean, states, governments will have a remarkable tool to identify people, and that's the nightmare. That's the dystopian nightmare of where the
exactly. I mean, the blockchain technology is fantastic. It's a technological revolution, but like any technology, it could be used just as nuclear technology, for instance. It could be used really for good or really to harm humanity.
Yeah, in fact, this is precisely what drove me out of the white hat space and into the arms of Bitnation, because the existing system, in complete honesty, the existing system right now, under the existing system, you can go to a dating site and set up a profile, and if a couple of people report you because they're mad at you, it will immediately hinder your ability to get credit cards, buy things online, and seek a job, because all of these private sectors share a back-end database, which is what they call a consortium. The device itself serves as a proxy to the person, but I was responsible for the algorithms. I can tell you with reservation that there is an existing form of economic apartheid that absolutely biases against those who are economically disadvantaged. And it is absolutely sucking up the biometric information. So what you're seeing is literally the form of a modern day Holocaust. It is literally happening now. So this is what makes a guy like me. I've got 5 kids, and all of a sudden I'm working for the pirates, right? Because Jesus, this is a serious deal. So when Suzanne says, don't put biometrics on the blockchain, she's not kidding. Because it's happening now, and people are willingly do it.
Yeah. So. I mean, I have a personal history with this, right? I mean, a lot of my family died in the Holocaust. James was a first-hand witness of the Holocaust in Rwanda.
The nation state at its finest.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's like literally saying, like James. I won't out James, but James literally saw like bodies floating by in the river, chopped up every day. I mean, we know what the nation state has done. And it's fucking horrible.
And how the state machinery is the most remarkable killing machine.
Yeah.
And I think the origins of Bitnation are that suddenly there's a technology available that makes it possible for us to trust people beyond the people that we know. And we've the justification for government has justified its existence by saying, well, we can manage those relationships beyond. Well, we don't need that anymore. There is a technology that makes that possible. It can be misused, as Suzanne said. It can be co-opted by the nation state and used to control us.
Not co-opted, really, but it could be used in the wrong way.
In a malicious way.
I mean, it's decentralized, so it can't technically be co-opted, but it could be used for malicious purposes.
Yes, but it gives us the opportunity to say, well, actually, the anarchist ideas, the ideas that we can live in a voluntary society are feasible. There's the last arguments of the nation state.
So, honey, let's give the actual anarchist opportunity.
Yes.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I'm sure, the more things like this threaten the power of the old way of doing things, which is violent domination and exploitation, the more creative and the more people and resources they're going to throw into trying to sabotage it. And it's, that makes it particularly challenging. It's sort of like, well, I'm trying to invent a car and my neighbor is doing everything he can to try to make it not work. Like,
Yeah,
it
really.
adds a massive level of challenge to it, to know that there are people with massive amounts of money and power who are going to be scared of, as evil as this is, they're going to be scared of the idea of a population voluntarily interacting without them being able to control it. So trying to invent something where you know that massively powerful entities are going to be trying to destroy it, is obviously, now you're not just building a nice car, you're trying to build like a bulletproof, armor plated, tank or something.
Right. But here's the thing, though, is that the product itself provides instrumentation for existing states to actually run functionally. So if they decide to remain on their path of ineptitude, then that's their deal. Like, the way I see it is that ultimately citizens will begin to realize that they can seize agency on their terms, and they can say, you know what, you guys talk about transparency and accountability, maybe you could deliver on it, because it turns out the platform delivers that. And they can wait for the state to do it, or they can do it themselves. And eventually it becomes a fool's errand. They decide that they're going to follow us or they don't. That's just how I see it. It's not an either or. It's like eventually people will follow this. This is it. This is the winning path. So you get to do it painfully or you get to do it easily. It's up to you.
Yeah. And a huge
Wait. So the way I see it is that, so from my experience so far, I mean, I think globalization is upon us, and because of global trade, global communication, global everything, global, obviously, internet. And, I don't think, and I think that is going to lead to the end of the nation state, personally. And it has nothing to do with what we are doing personally. This is just how things are going. And the logical conclusion of that evolution, if you look at it, how it's going so far, is that basically nation states are banding together to create multilateral institutions, like the European Union, like the United Nations, NATO, what have you, right? And so it's kind of becoming like, I hate to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's kind of like becoming a one world government, right? And that is the worst option, really, the worst. I want a nation state to go away, but I don't want it to be a one world government. And this is why we have to create an option where everyone can create their own government. Let's create 1 million of governments, right? 1 billion governments. Let everyone have their own government. And so this is why we have to do this,
Well, it's funny too, because the model, go ahead, sir.
I think an essential part, again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, like an essential part is the concept of decentralization, and in this case, the blockchain, where it isn't just, well, now we have a great idea over here that we're going to control because they will find a way to control it with the money and the influence they have. The thing is to make a thing that can't be controlled by anybody, which, again, you're already doing that. I'm not telling you that. Basically telling talking to the listeners.
But that's the truth with modification, though. I mean, if you look at the blockchain technology, it depends what it's used for. But if you use it as a public ledger, okay, so let's say I want to title my house on the blockchain, for instance, right? So now I will claim that the Vatican State is my property, and I will title it on the blockchain. That's centralization, if you ask me, I mean, obviously, no one can verify that fact.
Right.
So just putting it on the blockchain doesn't make anything decentralized.
Right.
You need to have a decentralized approval system of the data, right?
Right. So it's just a thing that can be used to decentralize, but it can also be
exactly. It is one tool in the toolbox. Yeah.
Right.
So one of the things I think that people struggle with is when we say 1 billion governments, what they take is their definition of government, and then they think that sounds like chaos. And I like to remind them that the structure that we're talking about, I would argue, already exists. Like we don't have to encourage them to create an entirely new structure. Like for example, within the software and hardware development worlds is this idea of a scrum, which is essentially just a small team, 3 to 5 to 7 people, and they are essentially a holon. Like that's how we structure our engineering team. It is a meritocracy. There's not really anybody in charge, and we have small quantums that deliver. And at the end of each one, we review the performance, and we're ruthless in our execution to make sure that we clean up. And I've worked in a lot of really large enterprises, and what that technically is a polyholonic fabric, just a whole lot of really high functioning holons. So all of a sudden, people who have worked in large enterprise will say, oh yeah, I totally know what that looks like. But as it turns out, that's how neighborhood associations come together. Like this has been my fascination in doing political advocacy, is the recognition that the most functional structures are already at the bottom. They're already there. They're the 5 to 7 moms that meet all the time, and they do their sort of thing. So what we're really proposing is a method by which they can seize agency on their terms, which is really just saying they can take what they already know works and use our platform to bring that transparency, accountability, trust, all that other stuff. And then it just comes together in a polyholonic fabric. So to me, that's easy. It's a no-brainer. It's already there. They're already doing it. And I think that's a really cool part, is to help people realize when we're talking about no rulers and no states and all that, we're just saying all that superfluous nonsense that's going on here. What we're talking about is just emphasizing what we already do. It's already there. And it's the basis of how humans have been working thousands of years.
I used to be a neocon, you know. I used to be a person who thought that you could bomb countries into peace. Literally, not a joke. And, you know, what made me change my mind, you know, I mean, it was complex, but let me give you a brief story. So when I was in Libya during the civil war in Libya, I was in Benghazi, and there was no government in Benghazi at that time. I mean, there was like 10 guys that called themselves the National Council. Who were like hiding out in a basement and changing the basement every day because they were targeted, you know. And they had their only function as a government was to speak with foreign media to get recognition. They had literally no governance function. And so it was literally no government. But, you know, there were like 200 volunteers keeping up the streets every single day. There were people engineers keeping the cell phone towers alive. People paid with their own money for guns to go to the front line. I mean, the entire society was entirely run in complete anarchy by volunteers. And it functioned really well, you know? And then when the government started to get more established and, you know, then all the fractions started to fight and it descended into chaos. So basically, the more anarchy, the more peaceful and functional, the more governmental, the more war.
I mean, we were both Suzanne and me were contracted.
That's how we met, actually.
At that time, to try and analyze what was going on. And we both came to the same conclusion that just leave it alone. Leave it alone.
Like, don't
it's
engage.
Evolving.
Yeah.
Each small town was developing its own independence and its way of being, and then had this terribly oppressive regime for, you know, whatever, decades. And yet we were told very firmly by our boss, me in the UK, Suzanne was working for the US, that we had to pick a winner. Yeah. And by picking a winner, we created a war. Instantly, the civil war in Libya that is still running from that point was because we were told to pick a winner.
Exactly. I mean, I even like published something in New York Times about it, you know, saying, don't get involved, just stay out. If you don't want another Iraq or Afghanistan, you just have to stay out of it and let them govern themselves.
Right.
So
like,
the whole you know? Organic process of rebuilding.
Yeah. Like, fuck all of it, you know?
Was completely destroyed by creating this absurd competition.
Yeah.
Where people had to fight with each other.
Exactly.
Who they want for some, you know, authority to take away their sovereignty.
Right, and that's the thing is, in, you know, wartime and peacetime all over the world, most of the people most of the time think and act like anarchists and don't even notice. And the thing that messes it up is dangling this thing of authority in front of them of, You know, instead of
Exactly.
just figuring things out, don't you want to make everybody else do it your way? And then
in
it's
fact,
literal, you know, bloodshed and hell on earth. And but people don't, you know, what you're saying before, it totally matches the fact that when people say, well, how would anarchy work? Exactly how most of your life works most of the time.
That's
and
exactly
most of the
right.
people around you, you don't go around just violently dominating people. You, like, all of the structures and productions that would be in a voluntary society are already there. It would just be removing that giant violent leech that's, you know, doing nothing but damage and destruction and oppression.
It's a middleman that is just killing people. It's like a middleman killing machine.
Yeah,
there was this.
That's all it is. And
wasting our money, surveying us and killing us,
and setting us each other, setting us against each other for no reason.
There was this ridiculous article a couple of weeks ago that was something like Bitcoin is funny, but blockchain is dangerous. I don't know if you saw it, but it was an asinine article that essentially summarizes as I spent some time in the .com and we don't know the unknown unknowns of blockchain. That was basically it. Here's the thing. The unknown unknowns of trillions of dollars of unaccountable and completely opaque accounting on the part of a parasitic government entity has resulted in us nearly destroying life as we know it, right? So that's a good unknown unknown. My feeling is that why not transition this to a known unknown within the context of transparency and accountability? That makes things a lot, that's why you're saying it's dangerous. That's the danger. So the other thing about this is that I had spent significant, literally decades doing advocacy of people who were skateboarders, right? Because they were being chased by cops, including myself. And ultimately, the most effective model was to arm the people who were functioning technically as anarchy, which were basically the mobs. There was like 3 to 5 to 7 of them, and they got things done, and they didn't care if anybody was in their way. They just self-organized and off they went. And that's frankly what earned me 2 years on the board of the Tony Hawk Foundation, was developing a model to make them successful from the bottom up, which resulted in it used to take 5 to 7 years to get apart. Now it takes 18 to 36 months, literally by eliminating all of that crap. So when we talk about anarchy and self-governance, what we're talking about is just taking that backpack that's full of canned goods and taking it off. That's like literally what we're saying. And so suddenly our buying power of our dollar that's taxed at about 40% becomes a little bit different, right? That's really what we're saying. So, you know, from my perspective, it's not quite so remote and utopian. It's actually fairly straightforward. And I can describe to you how to use a system to squeeze the opportunity costs out of systems that are being strangled.
Yeah, and also, I mean, we're not in the business of improving governments, right? We have no interest in improving any government. We want to outcompete them, to basically make them irrelevant. So, through providing cheaper and better services. Like, I mean, a good analogy is kind of like how email made the postal system irrelevant. You know, people didn't start to use email because of any ideological reason or anything like that. They used it because it was cheaper and faster. That's it.
Right.
So we have the same stance. And what we have been seeing now from governments, we have gotten some initial kind of feedback. You know, so some, I mean, not just us, Bitnation as an organization, but the crypto world at large, right? And we can see how regulations are shifting and the rest of it. And so the feedback that we are getting is that basically big governments like US and Saudi Arabia and Russia and China are basically becoming more and more against encryption. And small governments like Estonia or Switzerland or Singapore or Dubai are becoming more and more open to it and are trying to compete on a global market for governance services. And so I think this is how the nation state will go, how the nation state system will end, you know. In the transition time, which I think will take about 50 years, I think that small governments will start to compete on a global market for governance, and big governments will implode, basically violently implode, and start to oppress their people more and more until there's a revolution and a war.
Right. And we are up against a big psychological obstacle that often comes up, which is the fact that people would rather hear a description of a big centralized master plan, which is what politicians always are like. How are you going to feed us all? Well, let me tell you. Let Stalin tell you how he's going to feed you all, or Mao. And meanwhile, tens of millions of you are going to starve to death because people are so scared of what they don't control and they don't understand. And I tell them, look, I sort of understand that, but your fear should last as long as it takes you to go to the grocery store, because nobody there was forced to do any of that. And they pull off a miracle every day, and you can see it every day in your own life. You didn't need a centralized authoritarian master plan for that to work. Now let's see what happens when government runs things.
Yeah.
But people want that promise of, don't worry, I'll tell you how everything will work. And that's a huge psychological obstacle, because the central master plan sounds so comforting to people who don't understand things, and they don't notice the fact that it never works anywhere near as well as anarchy, as in let people voluntarily figure out a million different ways to do it.
Yeah, here's the really cool thing about this is that the existing technology market that most of us have lived through have provide ample examples for validating what Christian Christensen talked about, the innovator's dilemma, which is the markets that are, the products that are disruptive are cheaper, simpler, and easier to use every time. What we are presenting is cheaper, simpler, easier to use, and we will always be more nimble than the existing top-down structure. And in so doing, we outcompete. It's that simple. So in that regard, it's not any different than the first huge tan cell phone versus something else. All we're doing is following the same thing that allowed all of us to adopt technology over time. It's the same exact formula. And they can compete or they can fall behind. It's that easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the scary part is when people decide we have to let these political saviors force their master plan on everybody, because then they don't have to compete. It's just, you're going to do it our way because we put you in a cage if you don't. And that's but because people are so uncomfortable, with the unknown, most of them still cheer for that. They still cheer for a violently imposed central plan.
So there is a very famous saying from Edward Bitnation. He is like the biggest kind of propagandist in the world, right?
Yeah.
And working for governments actually. And he says, you know, on the front page of his book, he says, you know, whether you're an autocratic or democratic government, you cannot govern people without the consent of the governed, right? And I don't think people will consent to using one service if it's more expensive and less efficient and less secure and private. Then
it sort of ties into the whole belief system, though, because the consent that governments get is basically, we're going to dupe you into imagining a moral obligation to obey us, and then you're going to consent to being obeyed. Like, there's so much indoctrination involved. It's not at all a matter of, they walk out their door and say, well, here's this form of protection and here's that one. And then
I hear what, yes, I agree. The indoctrination is ballistic, but I mean, so this is why I use the example of the postal office versus email, right? People did not adopt to email because they had some like great ideological reason to do so.
Right.
It was just so much faster and cheaper and simpler and more efficient, right?
Right. But notice that a different technology had to come along, because when Lysander Spooner said, I'm going to make my own little post office, and this was like 200 years ago, or 100 and something, I'm going to make my own post office for the express purpose of doing it better than them and then getting arrested to demonstrate. And because people believe so much in law, that's exactly how it went. People are like, well, that's against the law. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to compete. And then email comes along, and that doesn't fit within their stupid old laws, so they can't really, like, they can't say, you're not allowed to use email. It just doesn't really work. But there's that first obstacle of people thinking that government actually has the right to not only force their idea on people, but forcibly prohibit other people from doing a different idea, a different version of caring for the elderly or the poor or defense or anything else.
Right.
So,
that's why.
So I had a call with the minister of the Kerala province in India a few days ago, 2 days ago, I think. the governor of the Kerala province, which is a very large province in India. And, you know, and what I told him was like, I know all governments in the world have financial problems, you know. You all have a budget and you're achieving a budget every time. So just stop providing the services. You know, we will provide them peer to peer for free. We don't want any money from you. We don't want anything from you. We just want you to stop providing the services so we can flip them and provide them for you.
And it make your life easier.
Yeah, exactly. You will save a lot of money. People will be happier. Like, what's not to like, you know?
Well, that's cool. Is I like. Go ahead.
For the non-sociopaths, that works pretty well. But there are people in the world who are such control freaks that their entire game is making sure people can't be free. Like they actually hate us for our freedoms. George Bush was one of them, where it isn't a matter of, oh, well, that takes a burden off of us. It's that takes control away from us, because these, you know, caring for the poor, the people at the top don't do that because they care about the poor. It's because they're training people and buying people's loyalty and dependency. And so if you're saying we'll take care of them for free, they will actively try to destroy that just because they're in it for their own power.
Well, they
good news is a bunch of their underlings may be doing it out of good intentions, and so they can be convinced that, yeah, why not just let this private thing do it better than us and for free?
Well, there's a place for that personality,
right? So if they would try to come at us, they can, and they will for sure. Some governments will. I mean, okay, it's not, our entire system is not decentralized at this point. I mean, we still use some centralized, like we have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter account, you know, those are all centralized infrastructure. So it's not entirely decentralized yet, but you know, day by day we are decentralizing more and more, right? So basically, they can't take us down because there's no central point of attack.
Right.
They can't stop us down, but they can't take us down.
Right. But they will actively try, even in situations that seem completely irrational and insane. Like, we're doing your job for you. We don't care. We get power from us having a monopoly on it.
Right. I mean, that's like
win, but they're going to try.
That's like when I was a kid, my dad got sick of people driving fast down the street, which had lots of potholes. So he fixed the potholes and the city came out and removed the patch because that's their job. Yeah. Right. I mean, that's a good example. That's like, you know, it's idiocy, but it's what happens. What I like to remind people is that I find the language of anarchy to be sometimes inaccessible to the masses. And I like to point out to them that, like, if you look at the definition of what they call a shadow economy, it's like literally what a lot of us engage in. In fact, by definition, it's billions of dollars in size. It's when I buy or sell a car and then I put the money in my pocket instead of report it to the tax man. Guess what? That's shadow economy. And it turns out a vast amount of all of our economies work in that manner. And it doesn't mean that we're criminals. It's actually a measure of just to what extent the existing economic and governance model can actually address the needs of its citizens. So in our case, I find it to be extremely disarming to talk to normal people and say, you know, what we're providing is a way that you can add the attributes of trust and transparency and accountability to what you already are doing. And then I can give actually very simple examples. I got a guy who lives behind me a couple of houses and he has garage sales every couple of weeks, which is nonsense. What he is he's a junk collector. He considers himself a historian, and that's how he sells his antiques, right? Well, as it turns out, it's entirely shadow economy. I'm pretty sure it's how he pays his mortgage, but he could use this model for precisely that purpose. So he doesn't have to incur the risk of unknowns, right? So there's lots of really cool things that can be used. And frankly, as mundane as those examples sound, that's the makings of a revolution. And what I like to remind people is, you know, we're not talking about spray painting an A on the side of the 7-Eleven here. We're talking about formalizing what you already do. Right.
But there's also an important element there this is a shift that's been happening recently. I forget when it was. A few years ago, somebody did a poll, and to me, it was one of the best indications of the hope for humanity. Which is, it was a poll of Americans asking, if you thought you could cheat on your taxes and get away with it, do you think that's morally okay? And for the first time ever, a majority said yes. Because there are still a bunch of people who feel morally obligated to get robbed to pay for a war machine. and they won't do the black market or whatever you want to call it, because no, I'm a good law-abiding taxpayer and I make sure I give lots of money to politicians. So even if they don't think in political terms, they don't view it as a philosophy, the more people who say, if I can get away with not being robbed by the state or the county or the feds, I will. That's the essence of voluntarism. I'm not, you might be able to rob me if you point enough guns at me, but I don't feel obligated to go along with it. And if I can sneak over here and do a trade here and a trade there without you noticing and getting any, I will. And that's been increasing by leaps and bounds, nothing resembling what they would call a philosophy, but just sort of a, screw you, you're not getting my money. But that's a very important step, because if people don't have that mindset, all of the tools are worthless, because they're going to say, but I have to pay taxes to my and all loving.
Well, and in fact,
people are like, the most hilarious part is like when people say, oh my God, that's illegal. Like, it's like, yeah, but everything is technically illegal.
Well, I mean, in fact, you can sidestep it when the economy goes bad. When the economy goes bad, and since God knows when, people have got scrappy and made work on the side so they can feed their kids, right? Like, I've been out of work for a period, and I've gone and I've done yard work, or I've worked on cars or whatever. By definition, that's a shadow economy. It's something that's work I'm doing on the side so I can feed my children. And what we're proposing is a way that they can formalize that in a architecture that enables them to seize agency on their terms. It's that simple. And what I find are people are increasingly dissatisfied with the false discourse that we have within the public space, where we have to choose between children's programming or fighter jets. That's a ridiculous choice. We know it. We know that it's a bullshit game and we're being ripped off, right? And so, like, what I like to people is it's not so much illegal. You are already doing that. You're already picking up extra work so you can feed your kids. It's just that simple. So.
Yeah, and also, I've been, so I used to have, so when I sold my last company, I had too much money and I was really drunk online. And so I bought a church in rural Pennsylvania on eBay, and I got 7 arrest warrants for it. I'm not joking. So I got arrest warrants because apparently snow was falling off the roof. Because apparently the grass on my property was 1 inch too high, and apparently the county limit for grass or whatever, not weed or anything, just normal grass, was like 2 inches, and apparently it was like 3 inches. And also because there was a tree on the property that was rotten, and so they sent me fines of like $50. But since I was fighting for years in Libya, I didn't receive the fines, and so that turned into negligence of court, and then 7 arrest warrants. I mean, really, this is what I property that I had, bought in a weird drunken moment, but nonetheless, my own property,
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's one of the tests you can use is how many people would really and truly think that you were the bad guy because, it's against the law and you have to pay the masters.
Yeah, exactly. So what's illegal,
Right.
So
the whole, the
no falling off my roof is illegal, apparently.
The whole notion of valuing law abiding has to go out the window for people to actually be free and to do these things. They have to realize all that means is a stupid politician somewhere made something up and I don't care. I'm just going to disobey.
So,
I mean, it's just so absurd, So, everything is illegal, apparently.
Yes. So to go back to the point that you made at the beginning, Larkin, about the problem of pseudo-anonymity. There's an obvious reason why we need pseudo-anonymous identities, or people to be able to choose them, particularly if they're in that informal economy. And I think that informal economy, this is kind of what we're building as a tool for people who want to live like that, but they can also use it to make sure they can create binding agreements and they can enforce them in a positive way without using coercion and be more confident about those agreements.
Right. I view it as my job to make as many of those people as possible, and then they
we want to give them a tool so they can kind of opt out but also not be caught, if you see what I mean, or not be pursued by the state. So, but one of the things we haven't implemented yet, but which we
provide
want to,
an effective alternative.
what we want to implement,
you know?
which I think is possibly the solution to the problem that you raised, is an ID system by which people can verify their identity, but verify it
but in a pseudonymous way,
without using biometrics, in a pseudo-anonymous way. We have one of our team is working on various models of what he calls proof of personhood, which is basically where other people validate that you exist.
You are Nugent, yeah.
So instead of it being you having to provide certain documents or photographs or fingerprints or whatever it is, rather than that, other people validate that you exist as a person, and then you
that's funny because when I was at the Anarchy event, and then at the thing you did, I was already going through my mind, I wonder what I would do to make my own little constitution and make a little Bitnation. And one of the things was I'd want somebody to physically know somebody else who's coming in, just as an experiment. Not like everybody else should do that, but just to physically know, like, I actually know this person.
Yeah. So when we did the first world citizenship ID, the concept was invented by a guy called Chris Evans. So basically, this is what we did, right? So we gathered in a room. We took the latest hash of the blockchain, and we held up a photograph of the picture with the latest hash of the blockchain, and everyone had to sign off on that picture with our public keys, right?
Cool.
Inside.
Oh, my battery's about to die. Stand by.
It's great having a discussion, both from a philosophical and a technical point of view.
Yes.
We usually have those two things separate, but to bring them together is fantastic.
There, I'm back.
So yeah, so I mean, it's doable. It's kind of clunky and not very user friendly at the moment, but it's doable, and we're working on the UI UX,
So, yeah, but we will. I think we've got enough kind of really good brains, and we'll certainly bring more in who think we think it's feasible to come up with an ID system where you simply are verified by other people who know you, and that becomes way
like peer-to-peer verification.
You can say that identity belongs to someone. You don't know who they are, but you know it belongs to someone who really exists on an actual.
But we also have to do it really carefully, because we also want people plausible deniability. So let's say, for instance, if you're gay in Iran, right, which is punishable by death, and you have been exposed as being such, then you want the ability to just start your identity from fresh. Or if you're if someone is trying to kill you or something, right, you want the ability to always provide a new identity, to start a new identity for your own security. But it should be difficult to do, but you should have the ability to do it.
Right. And that ties back to the challenge of the original thing, which is, if you did something nasty and deserve to have everybody hate you, it should be really difficult to make a new you. But if people are trying to oppress you for unjust reasons, you want it to be easier to make a new you. And that's
you can understand the challenges of instrumenting a system based on a table of morality. There's just no way I would endorse such a thing, because who are we, right?
Yeah. And he used to say what's bad and what's good. I mean, also, if you look at it from a pragmatic societal perspective. Okay, so let's say you're a kid in the US who smokes some weed and get caught smoking some weed. You're just like an average kid. Nothing very interesting, right? You get thrown into jail for 2 years because you smoked some weed. While you're in jail, you get brutalized by being in jail. You get a large network of other people who does far more hardcore things. Then when you get out, you have a criminal record, which means you probably can't get a job, etc., right? So suddenly you're not going to smoke weed anymore. Suddenly you're going to rob a bank.
Right.
And then you're gonna get 4 years in jail, and you're gonna come out and you're gonna, kill someone, and so actually, restorative justice, from I know, Larkin, you will freak out when I say collectivist, but
Cooperative.
yeah, but from a collectivist perspective, from a societal perspective, it's actually a really good idea, because if we prevent people from going in a downward spiral, making them more and more desperate, and instead provide them some, justice, but restorative justice, and
Right.
integrate them back in society, we're actually all a lot better off out of it.
I'm actually in the middle of making a video about how government justice is pretty much the worst possible solution you could do,
Exactly.
including to actual crime with actual victims. Like, even there,
Yeah.
it's horrendously counterproductive and self-destructive. And most of the people it punishes don't even have victims. They didn't even commit real crimes. So yeah, we're totally on the same page.
Exactly. And there is no, I have looked at a lot of statistics. From what I have seen, there is no correlation between harsher criminal enforcement and, an outcome that makes people less criminal. None.
Yeah. Yeah.
So not
Not the way
only,
they do it.
yeah,
Right.
it just doesn't work,
Yeah. Yeah.
But
and
I think also, if you have the option to create a new identity, but it's tough, it's hard to build it up.
Okay.
If you're someone who is likely to be dishonorable, because in order to build up the reputation, you have to be honorable for a long time.
Right.
So in a sense, the person who suffered the injustice is likely to build up their reputation more quickly than the person who is trying to game the system, because the temptation to be dishonorable will be there.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and in fact,
that's built-in checks and balances there could be, as far as I don't have a better idea of, because you do, good people and bad people would both want anonymity, and this seems to be the best way to reward the good and not reward the bad.
Yeah.
You only get,
it's
you
like
only have a
the
reputation
carrot
for
versus
being
the
good.
stick debate,
this is a fairly central case in the context of anti-fraud, right? So the first thing a bad guy is going to do is to try to obfuscate their identity, and they do it via one of two ways. One, they create a fake identity, or two, they steal one. So one, they can create a fake identity, what we call symbols, and there are, as it turns out, a lot of really good ways to create a disincentive to make that cost effective. But there are platforms out there that actually, you can buy PVA accounts for Facebook for just a few bucks each, and they are created at such a vast volume that they're not only easy to buy, they're easy to steal, right? They're just everywhere. There's just like a vast number of them. We've thought a lot about that particular case, but the other one that we haven't really talked about is the theft of an existing and established one. That's actually an extremely important and potent case in the context of commerce, right? They call that the ATO, the account takeover. For example, single sign-on, SSO thing, man, a really good way to pick up about 6 or 7 really high quality accounts is to do an ATO of a single sign-on account, right? So these are very potent cases. So we can talk about the use of symbols to game the system, but what's also the other issue is somebody stealing a high value account and basically misappropriating their accrued reputation, which is, as it turns out, a central issue in the context of anti-fraud, which, by the way, has flipped. Anti-fraud has now become real-time authentication. And authentication is a very interesting place to be in the information security world, because it's suddenly turned into ubiquitous opt-in monitoring. That's what drove me out of the white hat world, is that the existing systems will monitor your movement, and with as few as 30 samples can tell that you've deviated from your normal pattern, and then have associated that with higher rates of ATO, which means that if you decide you're going to check out a new coffee shop, you can be penalized for stepping off course. So this stuff, like, I would love to take this offline and talk about it, but I have obsessed about this, and we've had a lot of good discussions. But again, this is why I'm over with you anarchists, because I am no longer interested in being with the bad guys who call themselves the good guys.
Glad to hear
it. And speaking about that, Let's get married.
Let's get married. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain?
Yeah. So we got married like 2 years ago. But because of the state of the blockchain at the time when we got married, smart contracts wasn't really a thing back then. So, and it's not really a thing now if you think of it. But anyways, that's a different discussion. But anyways, so we couldn't integrate a divorce clause into the contract. So we had to get like a time limited marriage instead. So we settled on 2 years. And those 2 years expired yesterday. And
yeah.
so we have been officially unmarried for like 24 hours now.
Yes.
So
it's a performance incentive.
Yeah, quite.
To time limited marriage.
Yeah, so we have to renew our like marriage contract.
So Florian has been putting together a smart contract for us this time, which is a program which runs on the Ethereum blockchain. So instead of it being, last time we simply wrote a paper contract and got a lot of people to witness it.
Well, last time we did it on Bitnation, but now because of the ICO, we had to shut down the Bitnation website for security purposes.
Yeah.
So we can't do it on Bitnation anymore. So we'll just do it through my Ether wallet instead.
Yeah. So last time we notarized it on the blockchain, so we simply timestamped it on the blockchain. But this time it's going to run as a contract.
Yeah.
And we only really have one set of vows, don't we?
Yeah.
Do you want to repeat them?
Why don't we do once in the seat?
Okay, let's do once in the seat.
Okay.
Do you want to start?
We agree.
And we disagree.
Amorously.
And polyamorously. Back to back.
Shoulder to shoulder.
From here.
To the singularity.
We wrote that together in about 2 minutes before we got married last time. But
another anarchist made the scene.
Wonderful.
Excellent. That was awesome.
How are we doing, Florian?
Yeah, you just use my Ether wallet and sign the address.
Okay.
I will just send you the ADI and so on via chat.
So I'm going to go over to the computer over there because I need to sign.
I'm here for the food. But I don't see any food, you guys. Where's the food?
Food, yeah. Sadly, we've got a large amount of Indian takeaway today because I'm hopper.
I haven't had breakfast yet.
Okay, so it's probably going to take some time to sign it. Nonetheless, because I have to recover the seed of my ledger because long story, but whatever. So yeah, so maybe we should end the conversation here and then just post the contract that responses down.
Yeah. Okay. We don't need to do that in the.
Yeah.
We are married.
It's funny. We are married.
For another 2 years. Forever.
Yay! I don't have rice to throw.